Our brains contain about 100 billion neurons. Each one has 7,000 connections or synapses connected to other neurons. That's 2,000 times more than the number of stars in the galaxy. The galaxy! Everything about you is contained within these connections. Your memories, your personality, your likes and dislikes, your aspirations. But this isn't just a jumbled mess of randomly connected neurons. Our brain actually shows lots of regular structure. Specifically our neocortex. This is the part of the brain that makes us human and gives us the ability to recognize abstract patterns and predict possible future outcomes, more so than any other animal can. Neocortex literally means new crust. Our neocortex is the newest part of our brain, and it's something that all mammals share. Only mammals have a neocortex. But ours is the largest among all mammals. And it comprises about 76% of our entire brain. And it's why we have such big freaking foreheads. It's pretty incredible that only mammals have a neocortex, and we have the biggest one of all mammals. Most of our brain is just neocortex. So it must be pretty important. We might have billions of neurons, and among them trillions of connections, but the craziest thing is that there's a regular structure to all this. There's a pattern. Our neurons are actually organized into little pieces called columns, and these columns are essentially discrete functional units. They all have the same purpose and they all do the same thing. Not only that, but these columns are also themselves organized into hierarchies. Just like when you have a concept of something, like a house, let's say. A house is one thing in your brain. We have one word for it, house. But really, a house is composed of lots of different parts, and we can break it down into a hierarchy. So a house has windows and doors. A door has a frame, wood, a hinge, and a handle. A hinge has a pin, 2 pieces, screws, and you can keep going down the list forever. It's composed of atoms, however far down you want to go. So this is how we compose models of the world in our head, is because our neurons and our columns are literally organized into hierarchies. That's how they're wired together. We've known the importance of connections in our brain for quite a while, which has led to the creation of many computer simulations. One of these is neural networks. And most of these computer simulations, which are based on the connections within our brain and the brain hardware, are responsible for most of the things that we think of today as artificial intelligence. Just like our neurons have synaptic connections of varying strengths, neural networks do too. The strength of these connections is just represented by a number. This number is combined with the input using maybe multiplication or some other type of function. These inputs are combined together to create a single output which determine whether or not the neuron should fire. What a neural network really learns is the strength of these connections, the strength of the connections between its neurons, artificial neurons. So just like in our brains, everything we know is represented by the strength of the connections between our neurons. So it's the same in a neural network. And it uses these numbers, or the connection strengths, to take in something useful like an image and output some useful output, like what's in the image and where it is. So why don't we have robots running around that are indistinguishable from humans? Well, one reason is pure scale. We may have neural networks that can do amazing things like remove unwanted items from images, turn speech into text, classify what's in an image, and learn the attributes of music. But all these tasks are very narrow. They can only do one specific thing. Not to mention, if the data used to train this network is bad in some way, say is biased or mislabeled, or there just isn't enough of it, then the network still won't be very good. And all of this data has to be created by hand by humans, and these networks often need millions and millions of examples to learn anything even significantly useful. Not to mention, the most advanced neural networks we have today currently take hours, days, or even weeks to train. And they require hefty computing resources like GPUs and large clusters. And this stuff isn't cheap, it costs a lot of money. So in order to make a neural network that's capable of the flexibility of a human, it would take thousands or even millions of the neural networks we have today, because they all do one specific task, so we would need millions of them. Not to mention, we have no idea how these networks should be connected together, or how to run them all at once, because it would take so much compute resource. The Blue Brain Project is a Swiss-based organization utilizing experimental data to create models of real neurons. They're able to create networks of these neurons and run the simulations on supercomputers and verify their simulations against real experimental data. Their goal with the project is to create a closed loop in which they take a simulated brain, a fully simulated, possibly rat brain or human brain, hook it up to an animal, possibly a human, a simulated human, and run it on the computer and see what happens. Doing so allows researchers to perform experiments that they couldn't do otherwise, like analyze the activity of thousands of neurons at once. This allows us to see how the activity patterns change in response to environmental factors or even internal factors like oxygen levels or fluid composition. Given an accurate enough simulation, it may be possible to simulate some mental disorders and possibly even find cures. Not only that, but these simulations allow us to make our own devices smarter. Neural networks, which are responsible for many of the things we think of today as AI, like self-driving cars, speech recognition, natural language processing, and understanding, are all based on the architecture of our brains. Now we need some hardware. The current hardware we use is based on an architecture called the von Neumann architecture. This basically is a process of taking things out of memory, operating on them, and then putting them back. The big drawback to this is there's only one central processor, but there's a ton of memory. In order to process something that's on the disk or your hard drive, you have to pull it out, and this takes a long time. And you have to do this in a serial fashion. You can only put so many things through the processor at once. Well, our brains are basically one big parallel processor. Every neuron does its own computation. So the von Neumann architecture that we use for all computers today really isn't a good model to use to simulate our brains, and it's very energy inefficient. So we need new hardware! This is the DARPA Synapse. It's a board containing 16 IBM True North chips. These True North chips aren't like regular processors. They're event-based, which means they react to input and they only perform computation when they're signaled. Also, they don't have a central memory like your hard drive or your RAM. Every processor has its own memory and it's distributed across the entire board. Because these chips are event-based, they're more than happy to sit there and do nothing. But your normal processor has to be doing something all the time, otherwise it's underutilized. It's always running things like your desktop, your web browser, and your operating system. But since the IBM True North chips can sit there and do nothing until they are signaled by an event, they consume 1/10,000th the power of a normal processor. Neurons in your brain are triggered by sensory input and other neurons. And these are the events similar to what triggers computation in the IBM True North chip. Your neurons don't just sit there and try to figure out things to do, because that would be a waste of energy! So why don't we use these boards to simulate the brain? Well, let's do a little math. One board can simulate about 2 billion connections or synapses. But remember, we said the brain has 2,000 times more connections than there are stars in the galaxy. So in order to do this, we would still need about 260,000 of these boards to simulate the entire brain. This amount of connected synapse boards doesn't exist, but the Air Force is using them in a project called Blue Raven. In this project, they were able to simulate 64 million neurons and about 16 billion synaptic connections, while only consuming 40 watts of power. That's about the same as a light bulb. All of this fits inside of a 7-inch high server rack, so it's the same size as a normal server. If we borrow the concept from the Air Force of the Blue Raven project and use the same configuration of synapse boards, it would take us about 1,500 of these server rack sized boards to create an entire brain. And this is much smaller than your normal data center, which has about 30 to 80,000 server racks.